Good to see you guys. Thank you all for being here. If you weren't here last week, let me just catch you up real quick on what we went over. We'd been learning about the congregation to whom John was writing. It was a congregation that was facing a pretty significant crisis. I think of crisis of faith, crisis of identity, stemming from whether or not they truly had the teaching that would lead to life in the final age, and their confidence with respect to that. They were a church that had received the gospel initially either from the apostle himself or from an emissary of the apostles and from the church in Jerusalem. And they had been given the authentic teaching of the apostles, that early apostolic Christianity that sought to carry on the ministry and the message of Jesus. And they received that with joy. But as time went on, that memory of the initial reception of the gospel began to fade. And a new generation grew up that had received that teaching from their fathers in the church, but who hadn't personally received that teaching from the apostles. So their understanding of the gospel of Jesus hinged on whether or not their fathers in the church got it right. And at some point, false teachers have come to this church with a new message for them. Essentially that, well, look, if you guys want to have fellowship with the Father, if you want to have life, what you need to do is go back to, I think, upholding the Mosaic covenant. So that's, I think, what we're going to see as we go through the letter is that these false teachers were advocating that, look, we were there, we knew Jesus, we remember what he taught, and we remember him as being a good rabbi who got baptized by John in the Jordan. And he agreed with what John had to say. He agreed that what we need to do is repent and go back to keeping the law. So that's what you guys need to do. And so, as you can imagine, this created, a lot of confusion in this church and concern that they actually determined for themselves, well, who do we listen to? Which gospel is authentic? How do we have life? How do we know that we have life? How do we know that we have fellowship with the Father? And I don't know if we went into this, but that life that they were looking forward to was life in the final age. It was life in that kingdom that God promised through the prophets to the patriarchs, that life in an eventual perfected kingdom of Israel that was going to be led and ruled by this Messiah one day. It was going to be the place where you'd want to be. So we saw John introduce himself briefly, primarily giving an account of his own proximity to Jesus and to the original transmission of the gospel, the intimacy that he had with that original revelation as a reason why they should give him authority. They should listen to his authority with respect to what it was that Jesus actually taught and what they need to know in order to have fellowship with the Father. And then we saw him kind of go into an aside where he, from the perspective of an apostle, directly addresses the situation with the false teachers. And his biggest accusation of them is, look, if it is the case that we know that God, the Father, is wholly good, he uses the term light, and I think that by that he means God is all truth and goodness, because those are the things that he's going to keep hammering in this letter. Then to be in fellowship with Jesus, as these people claim to be, they claim to know about Jesus and what he taught, they claim to have fellowship with him, then to be in fellowship with Jesus is likewise to abhor evil and to embrace the truth. So if you're going to follow what Jesus taught, then you are also going to exhibit in your life the traits that mark the Father himself. It's going to be one and the same. And what he saw, and we have some evidence of that as we looked at 3 John, is that these teachers, far from living lives committed to the truth, and far from living lives that are committed to goodness, righteousness, and love, are actually living lives committed to wickedness. They are resisting They are resisting the teachers that are being sent from Jerusalem. They are putting people out of the church who want to hear what the apostles have to say. They're not acting in a way that shows a care for the truth or love for either people that would claim to love God as they do or for other human beings. It's not there. So that's a huge problem. Okay. So now John is going to go into, I think, the first of a number of criteria that he's going to present in this letter. That's a way for his audience to understand how can they know whether or not they're on the right track, whether or not they are in possession of the truth, and how can they identify who to listen to, who has the truth, who can speak to them authoritatively. Okay, so let's look at section 3 real quick. So this roughly corresponds to chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. So I think this is the first criteria by which John can judge if someone has fellowship with Jesus. They must embrace what he taught and live as he lived. As one who lived alongside Jesus, I can say that to know him is to uphold his teachings. By implication, anyone who claims to know Jesus and yet does not uphold what he taught is a liar, and the truth is not in him. If you want to know in whom the love of the Father is to be found, it is in the one who upholds what the Son taught. This is how I can tell if someone is in fellowship with Jesus. They will live as he lived. So again, here, John appeals to his proximity to Jesus to reinforce his claim to teach the authentic gospel of Jesus, and to be able to accurately identify whether or not others uphold Jesus' gospel. His authority derives from 3 sources. So first, he was taught the gospel from Jesus directly. Second, as an apostle, he received the Spirit of truth, and so his understanding of the truth is supernaturally authored. And third, as an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, he can judge whether or not someone lives as Jesus lived. I think we talked about this a little bit last time, how confusing it must have been for this audience to have dealt with these false teachers who claimed to have had a firsthand experience with Jesus, Well, how do we know whether or not you're telling us the truth? You're claiming to have interacted with Jesus, to have witnessed him, to have been taught by him, to know who he was. So, that's a huge claim to make. So, all the more important that then John himself as an apostle can make that claim of himself. Look, I was there. I was taught by Jesus. I remember who he was. And more importantly, I remember how he lived. So, John is I think, appealing to the fact that the truth that Jesus taught, the truth that these people are interested in, the truth that the false teachers are claiming to represent, is a truth that has a dynamic and existential impact on your life. It's a truth that's going to work itself out in how you live and the kind of person that you are. And one of the things that was absolutely remarkable about this man, Jesus, was that he lived a life that was wholly committed to obeying the Father. And that's what he taught. That's what true righteousness consisted of, being obedient to the Father. And so it's all the more impactful that he can then cast his gaze upon the life of the false teachers and weigh, do your lives match up? If truth, as we saw in the life of Jesus, must have this existential impact on who you are and the life that you live, has it done that in your life? What kind of life are you living? So, yep. Yeah, absolutely. No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So you're talking about these false teachers and how they kind of wanted people to go back to the law.
Mm-hmm.
But can you talk more specifically about how they interacted with the people that would that John would know that they weren't of the truth?
I think the most damning evidence that we have is the what he alludes to in 3 John when he talks to Gaius and says, so there's this guy Diotrephes in the congregation who is refusing to hear from us, refusing the emissaries that we send, and putting people out of the church who want to hear the message from us.
Okay. So they're rejecting actually people who've been sent by the apostles. Okay.
Either rejecting prior letters that John has sent, or rejecting the messengers that delivered those letters, the messengers that would have spoken in John's stead there in their midst.
Okay.
In a little bit, he's going to I think make a reference to part of what they're doing, by saying, does it make any sense to talk about having love if you see someone in need and you have what they need and yet you don't give it to them? You deny them, the world's goods, if that's what you have. They need shelter, they need food, they need hospitality, and you turn them out. And that would jive with what we see in 3 John as a description of what was going on there. So I think that it makes a lot of sense that that's a real pointed comment made towards what they're doing right there. That doesn't enlighten us as to what the false teachers were teaching per se. I think there's other places in the letter that are going to act as clues to, I think, give us that understanding that what they are advocating for is a return to the law. That's not one of them, but yeah, absolutely. So why is John's proximity to Jesus important? Well, we need authorities in order to navigate the competing versions of the truth that vie for our attention. Our ultimate authority is Jesus himself. But in his absence, we rely upon those who he has given authority to testify with regard to what he taught and how he lived. It's no accident that he's given authority to a group of witnesses. The claims of any individual within that set can be weighed against the claims of the others in order to strengthen their claims by consensus. And I think last time we talked about how there's a strength in that, but at the same time, consensus obviously doesn't make truth. It's not the arbiter of truth, but it is a way in which I think God put this thing together such that the apostles' agreement with one another on what Jesus taught and what the implications of the gospel are is powerful, and it is important, and it is something that should make us stop and think critically about whether or not we're going to take seriously their role as speakers for Jesus in his absence, and as people who have an authentic, reliable understanding of what he taught and what the truth is. I think it's really kind of shocking to me how few people I meet who have a passion for understanding what the apostles taught, and I don't understand why that is. If it's just that we don't really value the truth as a culture, if we don't understand how grave our need is for what the gospel promises, if we don't understand the role that the apostles play, but it's something that I think all of us need to do some serious work on coming to terms with. And that's that we're not alone in figuring out who God is and what he wants of us, in figuring out who we are essentially as human beings and how it is that we must relate to our Creator. There's a specific way that God's decided to do things, and it seems to me that if he is truly the creator of the universe and my story, then it behooves me to do business with him in the way that he's decided to do business with me. So we need to put the work into understanding what the apostles taught and taking seriously their words. The weight that John places on the importance of how the false teachers live as a litmus test of their understanding of the truth gives us a first important criteria for identifying the authentic disciple of the historical Jesus. They will live as Jesus lived. So presumably, John would ask this criteria to be applied to himself, as well as to the apostles, in order to validate their claim to represent Jesus. Of course, only the apostles can compare what they observe in an individual to what they experienced firsthand as witnesses. We don't have that luxury. We didn't see how Jesus lived. So that's why I think that in this section, this criteria that he lays out is really only applicable to John himself or to the apostles themselves. So he's really speaking from his position as an apostle here. But we can compare what we observe to the record that the apostles have left for us. They didn't leave us in the dark. So our comparison hinges on the accuracy of our understanding of the apostles, which is all the more reason to diligently study. Because in doing so, I think we're going to be better equipped both to see ourselves with unclouded eyes and to measure ourselves against, what's the sort of person that I ought to be if I am somebody who claims to be following in Jesus' footsteps. And we're going to be able to see one another more clearly, either to identify, that person actually isn't acting in my best interest. They're not interested in me coming to terms with the truth. And in fact, they're not interested in coming to terms with the truth themselves. Or that's the kind of person that I should spend more time listening to. They obviously know something that's valuable that I could learn from. So the fact that John sees the beliefs that an individual holds as being inextricably connected with the behaviors of that individual speaks to the nature of the truth itself. I don't think this is a set of truths that are compartmentalized and contextual. It's a set of ideas. It's not a set of ideas that one can agree with without implications for the rest of one's life, like this is a good chair, or I like cats. These claims bear no demands upon our lives, except for the cat one, maybe. They can be claimed in one moment and forgotten the next. They can be held by one just as validly not be held by another. I can appreciate or not appreciate that chair just as well as Josiah can completely disagree with me. And both are valid. On the other hand, the claims of Jesus and the truth that John is concerned with are claims that have an immediate demand upon our person, our values, and our behavior. These are truths that, if held, can't be forgotten from one moment to the next. These are claims that judge us rather than being subject to our judgment. And these are claims that invalidate all competing claims. They're absolute and they're existential. When I was writing my thesis, I was doing it on Marx and Solzhenitsyn, and the more I read about Marx, for all of the ideas that he had that had some merit or gained some traction in my mind, I was working at Target as a wage slave at the time. It really bothered me that the more I learned about the man himself, the more abhorrent he was as a person. He basically abandoned his family so that he could live off of Engels, who was a factory owner, so that he could write, so that he could, basically devote himself to this project at the expense of the obligations that he had to the people that were in his life. It made me very dubious as to whether or not his ideas, if they resulted in a life lived like his, really honestly had merit. Because all of these great ideas are lived ideas. They're embodied ideas. They have demands, existential demands upon who we are. So I think it's significant to look at how those ideas actually play themselves out in the lives of those that hold them. Because you can tell a lot about the validity or the value of those ideas based on the life of the person who commits themselves to them. Okay. Any questions at this point?
The value of the ideas that you're talking about, you're getting that from to kind of remain in him. Is that so? That remain in him, those they ought to remain in him, is shorthand for believe what Christ believed. Is that how you're taking it?
I think that in him is, he uses it as a technical term. It's synonymous with having fellowship with him.
Okay.
So, being part of the family that's identified as, those set apart for life, those that are children of God, those that have fellowship. So those that are in the light.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, it looked like reading your translation that you're taking that they ought to remain in him as, I mean, that's a very wooden translation, but that you're taking that as they ought to uphold what it is that the Son taught.
Yes. If they truly were in him.
If they'd remained in him, they'd uphold what he.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good enough.
Okay. So let's look at section 4. So I think we're going to see he's going to move on to reiterating that what he's writing has its foundations in the original teaching, but it'll also contain some new clarifications. So, on the one hand, John goes on to say, what I'm writing to you is nothing revolutionary. It's in keeping with the original teaching that you have received. On the other hand, it is a new teaching with respect to it being the truth as proclaimed by Jesus. The truth I understand also to be embraced by yourselves, as the darkness is passing away from your midst and the true light is already shining. This was such a difficult section when I was originally translating this, trying to figure out in what sense was this old, in what sense was this new, what was new exactly that he was teaching. It's fairly clear. He makes it clear in what sense what he's writing to them is old. I think he points out that it is what he's going to remind them of is the exact same thing that they were taught originally. It is that same thing that we talked about that he opens the letter with, that thing that was from the beginning, the original teaching, the message. But then he says, but it's new. There's something new that I'm going to lay on you. And what was it? And I, reading through this over and over, I was trying to figure out, okay, is it what he's going to go on to say about loving the brother? No, it can't be that, because obviously that was central to the gospel itself and to what they originally taught. So was it this whole thing that he's going to go into in a little bit about the spirit of Antichrist? And I tried to make that work a little bit. Well, that had to have been new in Jesus, because the spirit of Antichrist couldn't have been around historically before Jesus was on the scene. So that's new, right? But then he's going to go on to say, now you've heard it said, or you were taught that. So I had to throw that out, because clearly that wasn't new. They had that before. So Jack has advocated for the newness of this being the fact that it is an old teaching. There is nothing new that Jesus proclaimed in the gospel, particularly. But it was new in the sense that it was centered around him, and it was the gospel as communicated by Jesus, how he put it into words, how he related it to Israel. And it makes sense that it would be in that sense that what's new was new in Jesus. Okay. It would make sense too that if that was an accusation that the false teachers were throwing against the apostles, that look, you're just advocating for this newfangled thing, this new religion. this isn't authentic truth. This isn't what God wants from us. He's given us everything that we need. The newness of the gospel centered around Jesus would have been threatening. And so in that respect, perhaps he's saying, yeah, okay, this is new. Sure, it is new, but that's not an issue per se. So I think that there's some merit to that, and I'm willing to go with that. So I think here he is then acknowledging that there is an element to what he's teaching that is new, insofar as that it's the newness of the gospel as formulated by Jesus. And perhaps he's answering a criticism of the false teachers, that what John teaches is just another newfangled oddity. John also wants his audience, I think, to understand that what he has to teach them will be entirely in keeping with the original gospel that they received. Yeah.
You looked like you were moving on, so I'll ask this question now. I think I'm still not tracking.
Mhm.
If the original teaching that this church has received was the gospel that their fathers had heard,
Mhm.
which was from Jesus,
Mhm.
then how is what's making it new the fact that this is proclaimed by Jesus?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mhm. Right. Well, it wouldn't be new to them per se. The newness would be this accusation that the false teachers would be making. So John's saying, I'm not teaching you, what I have to say to you isn't anything new. I'm not gonna, turn the playing table over on you.
And that's new as compared to what Jesus said,
And
not
new
new
as
as compared
compared
to the
to-
Mosaic Covenant, for example.
Right. So it's not new with respect to what you originally received from, the apostles. But I'll grant that there is something new about it if he has in mind an accusation that the false teachers have leveled against what he's teaching. Sure, there's something new about it.
Okay.
So the fact that, that this is the gospel as centered around and formulated by Jesus. If they really were astute students of the scriptures and of the Old Testament, they would have recognized that actually everything that he taught was completely in line with the prophets, with the law, with the writings, all of it. So in that sense, it's not new. But in another sense, sure, it is new. It's been formulated differently. And it contains this radical, world-shattering revelation of how God has planned to create a way to solve the problem of how he's going to reconcile fallen, broken, sinful human beings to himself.
Okay, I think that makes a little more sense. So he's reiterating that he's not coming up with some newfangled idea. Mm-hmm. Like this isn't something he's writing to throw them for a loop.
Right.
But if someone's going to level the accusation at him that this is some newfangled idea, well, he'll play ball with them in the sense that now Jesus is there on the scene and we have to grapple with what it means that he was crucified.
Right.
But that's the only sense in which it's new.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so, because I couldn't make it work that there was actually some dramatic new content that he was giving to them. If there's any way that I can make that work, and this is a stretch, it's from 2 John where he talks about how they should actually respond to the false teachers, which is have nothing to do with them. Don't even give them bread, like send them on their way. So there's that part of me that in mulling over where they were at and kind of putting myself in their shoes, maybe maybe they were in a position where they felt that there was a bit of a bind that they were in, because on the one hand, they're committed to following Jesus. They're committed to loving one another. They're committed to being loving even to these false teachers, right? But in their lovingness, they're allowing a situation to persist in their midst that's actually unhealthy and destructive. So maybe you could make it work that there's a new content that he's giving them, which is you're doing great to love one another, but don't love them quite as much as you're loving them right now, because they're actually in line with the devil.
Okay. But it seems like you haven't run into anyone who takes the original teaching as the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant. Mm-hmm. The law.
No, I don't think here the original teaching is synonymous with the law. I think the original teaching, because he says it's the original teaching that you have received. So I think that it's that gospel message that he is going to keep advocating that they hold fast to. So.
Who are these people that John is writing to?
That's a good question.
I mean, are they Gentiles or are they Jews?
It would make sense to me that it's a primarily Jewish congregation.
That would make sense to me. So I'm wondering if, here's just an idea. Is it possible that the gospel, the original message that they heard or teaching that they heard, was the gospel presented in the framework of what they knew about the Old Testament? Mm-hmm. In terms of, because you can teach the gospel from the Old Testament and mm-hmm. what God had done and through Israel and mm-hmm. your statement about what God is doing, how God is bringing man back to himself. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if that's part of the framework, and then the new teaching is, it seems like he's actually making a connection, or a very strong connection between the consistency between the original message mm-hmm. and the new message. The new message being out of the mouth of Jesus. Mm-hmm. The old message original message is consistent mm-hmm. with that, but it's not, he's not real clear about mm-hmm. what that is.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it makes all the sense in the world that this congregation has that understanding of the Mosaic Covenant and of the roots of the faith.
Yes.
But I don't think that he's introducing the gospel of Jesus here. I think that the fact that he opens with look, they would live as Jesus lived.
Yes.
That's only going to have traction with them if they already had some kind of an investment in Jesus. And,
sure. Yes.
And as we go on through the letter, he doesn't go into either a defense of why Jesus is the Messiah, like you see in Hebrews, or a exposition of what the gospel is. He alludes to it, but it seems to me that the way that he is communicating these ideas is communicating them in a situation where there's an assumed knowledge
yes.
of the gospel. So
yes.
I think
Colin, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So you have the truth I understand also to be embraced by yourselves. So this is the truth as proclaimed by Jesus. He's like expounding on mm-hmm. that truth is embraced by them. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to paraphrase it that way and translate it that way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how is it here? Okay, so in most of your translations, it's going to say it's true in him, Jesus, mm-hmm. and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. He's going to go on in the next section. I think this is this is sort of a transition into a section where he's going to talk about the spirit out of which he's writing to them, and wanting them to know that it's out of a spirit of confidence in their investment in the truth. So I think that, so I made the decision to put that statement in there, the truth I understand to be embraced by yourselves, because I think that that's why he says this here. Why does he say that the darkness is passing away and the true light is shining? I think he's saying that because he's referencing it as evidence that he can point to, that gives him confidence that the people that he's speaking to are interested in the truth. They do have the truth. So that's why I just kind of brought that right out into the open right there.
So you're taking the in him to be as proclaimed by Jesus, and then the in you to be as embraced by the people that John's writing to. Am I seeing that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So yeah, it is. So this commandment, this new commandment, the gospel is formulated by Jesus, is going to be true of anyone who has fellowship with Jesus. This is what they will hold in common, and I am confident that is also true in you. So he's saying, and you're part of that group too. You're in him too. I'm confident, because what I know of you is that the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. And I think that, again, that's sort of poetic allusion to the fact that he's confident that they are holding to the truth and they are seeking righteousness.
So the truth being in them is another way of saying that they're living as he lived. Would that be fair to say? Like, as I say, walking as he walked.
Yeah, to the extent that it's reasonable that any of us can or do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Can I do one more?
Yeah.
Sure. I want to go back to what Kelley and Larry were talking about earlier. There's like a little phrase that one could put in there, and which phrase you put in there gives you two totally different ways of taking it. And it is the original teaching that you have received. And the two options are from me or from one of the apostles. And the other option would be prior to learning about Jesus. See what I'm saying? So you were suggesting that they would have already have heard about Jesus. They could still have heard about Jesus, and he could still be referring to teaching that they had prior to learning about Jesus. In other words, the Old Testament. The difference, the one problem that would be a little bit easier if it was prior to learning about Jesus is that what's new is really obvious. And if it's what you have received from me or one of the apostles, then what's new is a little bit harder. So I guess the question would be, is there any problems that are solved better by choosing from me and the apostles? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that if you look at that as their understanding of the Old Testament, then you're right. It does make what is new much clearer. But since I think the original teaching that he has introduced from the beginning of the letter is the original teaching about Jesus himself, it's a teaching that has to postdate Jesus. It has to because it's about how one is going to attain to life in the final age through the intercession of Jesus. Then I think for the sake of coherence, I've decided to to make all of those instances where he talks about the original teaching as being referring back to that same thing.
So there are multiple references to the language original teaching that have appeared in various places, and in those contexts, you think original teaching is talking about the teaching that was received from him or the apostles? Is that
Right.
Is that how you're going at it?
That's how I'm going at it.
So I have an idea. Can I bounce it off you?
Sure.
So in your in chapter 2, verses 3 through 6, you're talking about the emphasis of a true follower of Jesus lives in a manner after the way Jesus lives his life. And in this verse that you're looking at now, he's talking about the truth I understand also to be embraced by yourselves as the darkness is passing away from your midst and the true light is already shining. So he's talking about evidence of he's seeing they're living in after the way Jesus lives. They're living in a similar manner. They're following Jesus' example in a sense. So there's this theme that's going through these two sections.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if I'm changing my mind about what I thought before. I'm wondering if the original message was just life comes from Jesus, like his death and resurrection sort of message. And this new message is that gospel makes a difference in how you live. That's just an idea. Because that seems to be what he's talking about here. I mean, kind of throughout the whole letter.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be. I think we'll have to suspend that question, that idea, because I think it's got a lot of merit.
Yeah.
And as we read, ask ourselves if what we encounter is actually going to support that, or if it's going to paint the picture that connection between the truth and their life was something they already were in possession of. So. Okay, so let's move on to section 5. So a lot of these criteria that John's going to be giving us have a corollary. He's going to say, you will know that someone has fellowship with the Father or with Jesus because of X. And then there's going to be a corollary that's going to go with it most of the time. And the person who has X is going to love others who have X too. Okay, so here's a corollary, I think, to that first criteria. The one who is in the light will love his brother because he is a human being and deserves our love just as Jesus demonstrated. I don't think I really did justice to this. I think we kind of glossed over it last week, but remember in chapter 1, he has this sort of aside comment about Jesus and the fact that, hey, don't worry, even though I'm not, advocating that any of you guys in following Jesus go out and sin. That's not what I'm saying by any means. If anyone should find themselves in a position where they are living in a way that's inconsistent with what Jesus taught, it's okay. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus. And he goes on to talk about the fact that Jesus' advocacy, his death, that sacrifice, was made not only for them, I think he says, but for the entire world, the whole world also. So there's something significant I think John is doing there by pointing out the scope of Jesus' mission and his sacrifice. It's significant to John that death that he died, the role that he plays, is a role that's not restricted just to Israel or Israelites. It's for the entire world. It says something really powerful about the scope of God's love for his creation, the scope of God's love for human beings. And if we are people who, in our having fellowship with God, ought to live lives that reflect God's values, we ought to be the sort of people who also love other human beings, who also love our fellow creature. So So if we read this section here, that you remain in the light of the truth is evidenced by the fact that you love your brother. But there are those who claim to be in the light, and yet they act towards their brother out of hatred. They are in darkness. The one who hates his brother is in darkness. It is the path he walks in blindness, and he knows not where he goes. That's really powerful language that John uses there. Obviously, he has the false teachers in mind. He has in mind the treatment that the apostles and their emissaries have received at the hands of these false teachers, or at the hands of any people in this congregation who may have aligned themselves with the false teachers. The way that they have conducted themselves is evil, and they are showing themselves to be in darkness. If you want to be in the light, you don't want to have anything to do with their way of doing business. There's two different ways you can take this. So Jack, I think, has made the argument before that anytime you see in the New Testament the apostles use the term brother, that they're talking about another believer. So his argument here is that essentially the false teachers, in claiming to have fellowship with Jesus, in claiming to represent what he actually was, which was a prophet who, upheld the baptism of John and was advocating that we actually repent and return to the law. Well, shouldn't they love us then? Because we claim to be in fellowship with Jesus, so aren't we brothers? Shouldn't we have some sort of common ground, some sort of identity shared? Isn't it strange then that they should treat us with what amounts to hatred? So that's one way to take it. So the strength of the argument is based upon a disjunction in terms there. The other way to take it is if you put the weight on the scope of Jesus' sacrifice as John related it to us back in chapter 1. Or maybe it was at the beginning of 2. Yeah. 2:2. He himself is the propitiation for our sins, not for ours only, but for those of the whole world. If you see that as significant for John sort of setting up this argument here, then they are brothers in the sense that they are fellow human beings. And if Jesus, in sacrificing himself for all of us, showed no distinction between one person and another, that was the most significant and incredible act of love anyone could have made, and he did it for all of us, then it makes no sense that these false teachers should treat us this way, because we're fellow human beings too. So that's the other way I think you can take that. I'm not sure which way to go with this. I don't have enough experience with the Greek to know yet whether it is true that brother is only used for other fellow believers or not. But I think either way, the argument is essentially saying the same thing, and it's equally powerful. There's this huge disjunction between what they're claiming and how that should pan out in the simpatico they should have with us, either as fellow believers or as fellow creatures under the same creator. The disjunction between that truth and the way that they're treating us. It doesn't add up. So if they're doing this thing and showing themselves to be manifestly blind to the truth, why would you want to follow them? It makes no sense. What do they have to offer you? Blind leading the blind, and you know how that goes. Any questions on that section?
Sure. So I may have missed it last week.
Mm-hmm.
I may have missed it last week, but the false teachers are acting badly towards the apostles and those who believe what the apostles said. And that came out in the first section.
Mm-hmm. It really comes out in 3 John.
Okay.
I think it makes a lot of sense to look at these three letters as intimately related, probably delivered all at the same time. 2nd John reads very much like kind of a abstract of 1st John. Let me give you a quick rundown on what I'm interested in covering and teaching you. But if the evidence from 3rd John, is reliable, then what he had to say here wasn't getting through. He was being blocked by these false teachers and by those in the church that were hostile to what the apostles had to say. So 3rd John shows, I think, the apostle sending this all to Gaius, who was a guy on the inside of this church who he was confident he could trust and who was sympathetic to what he had to say. And he instructs him, hey, make sure this gets read in the church, because this dude Diotrephes is quashing, our message. And in fact, I think as he says here, what does he say here? Yeah, I'll call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words, and not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brethren either, and he forbids those who desire to do so, and he puts them out of the church. So, pretty dangerous if you wanted to stand up for the apostles and what they had to say at that time.
So does John think the false teachers are believers and therefore brethren?
No.
And therefore have brothers that they're being
well, that's the tricky thing, right? Because no, he clearly doesn't think that they have fellowship with the Son. He's going to make that very clear, and he's going to make it clear that if you don't have fellowship with the Son, you don't have fellowship with the Father.
Right.
So if brothers is only believers, then it doesn't apply to these false teachers. So the only way that he could be using it here is kind of tongue-in-cheek, right?
Yeah. They're being wrathful towards their supposed brothers.
Yeah, exactly. If I'm going to take your words at face value, shouldn't we be brothers?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna move on here. All right. So section 6. This is, I think, a clarification that John's purpose in writing is to encourage them and to warn them not to imitate the false teachers who are ultimately motivated by their love of the world, which is antithetical to an authentic love of God. Okay, so I want to clarify and reassure you that I'm writing you from the confidence that you are in fact his children, and that your sins have been forgiven on account of your belief in his name. To you, the fathers of the congregation, I'm writing because you've embraced what was taught originally. And to you, the young men of the congregation, I'm writing to you because your belief shows that you have overcome the influence of the evil one. And it testifies to your strength and the fact that the word of God abides in you. I am writing to you all because you know the Father. But I also want to admonish you, in the light of what is developed concerning these false teachers, not to love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, then the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the desires of our eyes, and the craving after respectability, these things are not from the Father, but from the world. And we know that the world is passing away, and with it, all that it promises. But the one who does the will of God abides forever. So before launching into the body of his letter, John pauses to reassure his readers that he is writing to them from the belief that they are children of God who stand to inherit life. The phrasing of his address to them seems to divide his audience into two groups, the fathers and the young men. They're not portrayed at odds with one another. Rather, their distinctiveness, aside from being generational, seems to be their relationship to the original teaching that was received. It would make sense that the fathers were from that group that was present when the gospel of Jesus was originally taught to the congregation, as I've suggested. They've embraced that teaching and have sought to pass it down to the younger members of the congregation. The young men, however, while embracing the gospel as their fathers have taught, don't have a memory of the source of that teaching, and they've trusted it on the authority of their earthly fathers. So they now have questions occasioned by the competing claims of the false teachers. And John seeks to reassure these young men, strengthen the claims of the fathers, and counter the claims of the false teachers by weighing in on the situation and appealing to his own authority. If most of you, if you're familiar with this section in 1 John, it's a wonderful poetic section where he goes back and forth, to you, the fathers, to you, the young men, to you, the fathers, to you, the young men. Very reminiscent of Hebrew poetry, where the sort of strength of what he's saying is built by the repetition. I decided, just for brevity's sake, to combine what was said into one phrase, where what he says of the fathers is here, what he says of the young men is here, and what he says of them together is here. I found that easier in my mind, just to organize it that way. It occurred to me the other day as I was thinking about this that, what an amazing thing it would have been to have been one of those fathers who received the gospel from the apostles themselves or from an emissary of them, somebody who can actually say, hey, I'm from the church in Jerusalem. I was sent by John or Peter or somebody. This is the good news. And I was thinking about the fact that, ever since that first generation, we're sort of all condemned. It's too harsh of a word, but resign ourselves to being always the young men who have to take it secondhand. And then the more I was thinking about it, I thought, no, actually, that's not true. That's not true at all. Because we have the opportunity to actually read from the apostles directly. We have the opportunity to sit at their feet and learn from them. We have the opportunity to become like the old men, like the fathers who received that good news from them firsthand. That report and that testimony is still there to do business with. So just a thought I had the other day. It's not entirely clear in 1 John where this transition is between what he has to say of the fathers and the young men and what's going on in what immediately follows it with respect to not loving the world. It's a really abrupt transition, and it's not entirely clear how those are related. I think it makes the most sense to me, and this is why I put in what I did. It makes the most sense to me that if he's writing out of this spirit of confidence in who they are and what they've committed themselves to, and yet if he has enough concern about the situation that they're facing to write this in the first place, right, then it makes sense that the admonishment that follows is sort of a balancing statement. Balanced with the confidence that he has in them is also this warning. I'm confident that you have the truth and that you're committed to it, but you have this choice ahead in front of you. You can love the world, I think, as the false teachers do. I think that's what's motivating what they're committed to. It's motivating the move that they've made to abandon the gospel in favor of a performative religion that they understand and are comfortable with. You have that same choice. You have the same choice to value what they value and to do what they've done, or to continue to hold fast to the gospel. So I think his audience's temptation to follow the false teachers and abandon the gospel of Jesus would be to love the things of the world. It would be to value what the world has to offer and appeals to in them. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. Those things as being greater and more valuable, more important than the promises of God. This is, I think, what the false teachers have done. They've exchanged the promises of God for a competing set of claims that appeal to their worldliness, their humanness. And so I think this admonishment we need to take very seriously. I think it's all too easy to weigh what we physically see right in front of us, what we can touch, what satisfies our body and our pride now, immediately, as being more valuable and more important than a seemingly abstract and distant set of claims made by an equally distant and seemingly abstract God. And I think this is the essence of faith, to value and place our hope in the one that we don't see and in the promises that remain for us far from immediate, rather than to live for the few feet in front of our own faces, hoping for nothing higher than the satisfaction of our appetites. This is what also marks our humanity. I think that being a man as God has designed us rather than an animal is to live lives oriented towards our Creator, to live lives of moral and spiritual significance, seeking to satisfy our Creator rather than our appetites.
So do you have a sense or an idea of how the false teachers, I mean, what John is doing here is he has these categories that he's like the love of the world, or all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the desires of our eyes, and the craving after respectability. I mean, I have an idea about craving for respectability, what that looks like, but what would have been the message of the false teachers trying to convince these group of people to go there? What would they have actually said that John would use this language to describe that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's not that the false teachers would have said, hey, isn't it better to just serve yourself and to get what you want now? Like, let's go down.
Yeah, I get that, but how would they have justified that or spiritualized that?
Yeah, they're not saying that. Absolutely not. They're saying, look, we need to be obedient to God in this form and in this structure. So I think that probably their appeal, and probably part of why it's troublesome and confusing, is it's an appeal that's kind of couched in truth, in a way, in partial truth.
Do you have any idea what that would have sounded like?
You remember what Moses taught us? You remember Moses being the prophet of God? He was the one God talked to face. And you remember what Moses taught us. Don't abandon that. We need to be obedient to the form and the structure that God gave us.
Okay.
But what John is putting his finger on here is, yeah, but why are they interested in that? Why do they find that?
So looking at the heart of it.
Yeah, why do they find that more compelling than the faith that Jesus is advocating? And I think that it's really the last category that nails it. It's that kind of woodenly, most places it's translated as the boastful pride of life. And I think that what he's getting at is that desire for respectability. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Especially within the Jewish community. Yeah.
Colin?
Yeah.
The picture that I'm getting of that too is that John's problem with these teachers would have been pretty much the same problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees. The same kind of, and this is something that I feel like I've struggled too. It's so hard to pin down with what somebody is saying, like this specific thing that they're teaching is wrong. A lot of the time it's more like you could say it that way and mean something good or something really off. Like the words are the same, but it all depends on to what end what are the values that are really driving that. And I find that really interesting with what he's doing here is he's not breaking down their teachings and giving like a point by point rebuttal. He's saying, does the way these people are living and the things that they're encouraging, like really encouraging you to be about, match what Jesus was about and the things he encouraged you to live and the way he encouraged you to live? So yeah, I just found that interesting.
Yeah.
So 2 questions on this section, or a question and a thought. One is this the first place in traditional translations that the word or phrase abide shows up, or does it traditionally show up earlier in 1 John? I was just wondering, it's such a classic 1 John word, and this is the first time I've seen you use it so far. So I was wondering if you've made different translation decisions about it earlier.
I have, mostly because it's not entirely clear, at least in how we use the word, what John's getting at. So I think more often than not, I've translated that as something like remaining in him, holding fast, that sort of thing.
But at this point, you're switching over to abide. Is there a particular reason why, or just a sense that it's more fitting somehow?
I don't think there was a particular reason there. It may simply have been, not to be totally redundant, stylistic.
Sure. And then the thought, I was just wondering if you ever considered but I also want to admonish you section as an aside similar to the end of section 2, or do you see what it's talking about as more critical to his argument than the aside about propitiation? Does that make sense?
Well, that should be in parentheses. First of all, let me just put that out there that
I think it was in parentheses.
But I also want to admonish you that I totally just stuck that in there. That's not in the Greek.
Okay.
That's me putting a phrase in there that creates a transition that I think highlights how what follows is connected to what preceded.
So you see John is treating it as following, and you're emphasizing that by adding the phrase, or you see John is treating it as something separate based on the abrupt transition, but you're tying it together.
I think it follows, because I think the section relating to his confidence in the fathers and the sons, and this section that's essentially a warning, I think are two sides of the same coin of what's motivating him to write this letter. He wouldn't write this letter to them if he didn't have some confidence that they were interested in the truth. What would be the point? And he wouldn't write this letter to them if he didn't feel some concern that he as an apostle should weigh in, because they have a significant choice in front of them. And he wants, as an apostle, to tip the scales.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you see a connection between him saying that, where is it? The stuff of the world is passing away, and with it all that it promises, and the darkness that is passing away as the true light is dawning? Okay.
Yeah, although, they're kind of manifesting differently. Here, as he's speaking of the world, it's in general. If we're talking about the grand scheme of things, the world, this age we're living in, it's already doomed. It's already done for. We're just waiting for Christ to return and put a bookend on it. So if this is what you're investing yourself in, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because it ain't going to last. So that what he's talking about there, I think, is much broader. But I think that the darkness that he talked about earlier is passing away is, I think, more narrowly how an investment in the world would manifest itself in one's own life personally. So. Okay, I am not going to start into the next section because it's long and there's a ton to talk about, and we're just not going to get through it. So, if there's any more questions, we keep this discussion going. We got another 10 minutes or so. Otherwise,
yeah, I guess I'll take another shot at it. Kelley, I think you were talking about the propitiation stuff that he was doing earlier, that it seems as though he's saying, you know what's right and you believe it and you're saved because of that.
mm-hmm.
But there's, and Larry, you had said this earlier, you're thinking that the new message the new covenant that he's talking about is that not only do you need to know that Christ saves you, but that has some implications in how you live your life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that will manifest itself in how
mm-hmm.
you live your life. And therefore don't give in to the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and that. Is that how you're thinking about it? Or were you thinking about it, don't listen to what they're saying, which is lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes? So is he saying, listen to what the message is, it will save you. Good, you've done that. Now don't listen to their message, which is this other thing. Mm-hmm. Or is he saying, you've believed, that's great, you've learned the right things, now act on that belief?
I think it's the former.
You think it's the former?
Yeah.
You think it's, you believe the right things, don't believe the wrong things, which is what they're saying.
Right. Yeah, because we're gonna see evidence in the letter that they are also acting rightly, that they are loving one another, that the truth that they have believed has manifested itself in their lives. So I would lean towards the first option that you gave, that the admonition then is not, don't do these things because you need to be doing the other things. It's don't believe these things because the sort of person who believes these things is interested in these things. They're being motivated by their worldliness.
I was thinking about that as you were talking earlier. And it's interesting because I think I grew up thinking like you get saved and then you stay saved and that's great. And the hard part is getting to that point where, but it's not all that hard. You just have to like believe the right things and stuff. But it's been interesting reading the New Testament and trying to understand what they're saying, because the stakes seem a lot higher than that. It seems like a really big deal that you stay faithful. Like, and if staying faithful is such a big deal, then it must not work in quite the way that I grew up thinking that it worked. That this choice of who is really going to be more important than me, myself or God, these people or God, like that's kind of a decision that's sort of continuously before me in my life.
Yeah.
And I have to work really hard to try to stay the course. Of course, there's like this element of God's mercy, and that's only by his mercy that I could stay the course, and that he is merciful to do that. But it's still from where I'm standing as just a little human being, it's still something that I have to continuously work at. And there is always that chance that I might decide, this isn't important to me anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that seems to be where John is seeing his audience as being. They have shown themselves to be interested in and to love Jesus, and he's encouraging them to not be dissuaded and distracted by something else.
Right.
Is that how you're? So
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
And I think I agree with you that that's how the New Testament presents our faith and the content of it, what it should be, and the predicament that we're in. I mean, we're sort of always asking the question, am I the sort of person, was the seed sown on soil where thorns are going to grow up and choke it out? Or am I the sort of person that this is going to bear fruit and bear fruit that's going to last? Because there was the option in that parable that the seed bears fruit and it looks good for a while, but these other competing values, these other competing ideas, desires choke it out. So I think you're right that it's a life and death struggle, because that's essentially what the stakes are. And it's a life and death struggle that is moment by moment, ongoing. It's infinite, because it's a struggle that's happening inside me as well as out here in my actions. It's about my attitudes and my commitments, my thoughts. Who am I going to be? And that's something that I have to face. I never get away from. I never get away from myself. I mean, how tragic would it be if all Christianity was about was saying, yeah, I agree, I'll get on board with that, and that's it? I mean, it's something that's both terrifying and exhilarating, that the life God calls us to is infinite in respect to how deep it goes, and infinite with respect to my own engagement and the process that God's going to bring me through to come to terms with myself and the truth and who He is, and whether or not I'm going to trust Him and submit to who I ought to be. It's huge. Well, thank you guys.